Hello, welcome everyone to the Mental Health Commission of Canada's webinar series on recovery-oriented practice. This is the 6th webinar in a series of 7 that the Commission will be holding in English. There are plans to hold a French language webinar series that's also being planned. I'll just start off by apologizing for the beeping noises that everyone may be hearing. We had attempted to mute the beeping as people entered and joined and left the conference, but unfortunately weren't able to. So we apologize and hope that you are patient with us and aren't disturbed too much by that noise. So my name is Amy LeBlanc, and I'm the Manager of Prevention and Promotion with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. Today's topic is responding to the diverse needs of everyone living in Canada. And the webinar today will give a broad overview of this chapter from the recovery-oriented guidelines. And it's looking at the different needs for people across the lifespan, as well as being responsive to immigrant, refugee, ethnocultural, and racialized people, as well as being responsive to gender differences, gender roles, sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender status. Future webinars will dive more deeply into these topics individually, and so today is intended to provide a broad overview to this dimension. We have participants joining us from across Canada, so welcome to all of you. And we invite those of you who are using social media to use the hashtag #MHCC_HopeLives and our Twitter handle, which is @MHCC_regarding today's webinar. When the webinar is done, we have an evaluation survey that we are asking you to take a moment to fill out. It gives you a chance to provide your feedback, and that helps us inform future webinars. It also allows you to indicate whether you want us to contact you for future webinars and other events related to recovery. So there's an option for you in the survey to opt in for future communication. So just a little bit of a few housekeeping items before we get started. Again, I apologize for the beeping for those of you who have just joined. Unfortunately, you're going to hear the beeping noise as people join and leave the webinar, so I do apologize for that. We are hoping that you'll have questions and comments, and we invite you to note any of those or write any of those using the chat feature, which can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you can't see the chat box, look for the icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and it says chat. It looks like a little bubble. So if you click on that, then a chat window should appear for you on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint slides. So we're encouraging you to ask questions and make comments. And when you do, if you could please use the drop-down menu and select all panelists, and that way the questions will go to myself as well as the presenter, and I'm going to ask those questions on your behalf. So if you wanted to chat with all of the attendees, then simply select all attendees. To let you know, the webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on the MHCC website in the webinar archive section in about 2 weeks following this presentation. We'll also be posting the slides from today's webinar in English and French. And then due to the large number of you that have joined us, we've muted your phone lines just to eliminate any background noise. So to give you a bit of background on the Guidelines for Recovery-Oriented Practice and the webinar series, at the Commission we started this webinar series as a way to introduce the Guidelines for Recovery-Oriented Practice, which were released by the Commission about a year ago in June 2015. The guidelines were developed through extensive consultation, and they attempt to take the concept of recovery and provide a comprehensive review of what it means to apply recovery orientation in practice or within organizations. Within the guidelines, you'll find six dimensions of recovery-oriented practice. We've held 5 webinars so far. They've been held between January and March, and in those webinars, we provided an overview of the guidelines, explored the topics of creating a culture and language of hope, transforming services and systems, recovery is personal, and recovery occurs in the context of one's life. And the webinar recordings from these sessions are available on the MHCC's website. So today we're focusing in on Dimension 4, how we respond to the diverse needs of everyone living in Canada. And so I'm very pleased to introduce you to our speaker for today's webinar. Dr. Howard Chodos is the former Director of the Mental Health Strategy at the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and he very kindly stepped out of retirement to join us today. Howard is a mental health policy expert who led the development of a number of key Canadian documents, such as Out of the Shadows at Last, Transforming Mental Health, Mental Illness and Addiction Services in Canada, as well as Changing Directions, Changing Lives, Mental Health Strategy for Canada, and as well the document that we're speaking about today, the Guidelines for Recovery-Oriented Practice. So we're very pleased to have Howard with us today, and I will pass it over to Howard to start the webinar.
Thanks very much, Amy. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. It's a pleasure to be here again as part of this webinar series that the Commission is doing on the recovery guidelines. So today, as Amy mentioned, we're not going to try to cover absolutely everything that is in the chapter on recovery, on addressing the diverse needs of everyone living in Canada. But what I wanted to do was to provide a bit of background on how the topic of diversity is approached in the guidelines, why addressing diversity and respect for diversity is a crucial issue for the recovery guidelines to address, how we understand the meaning of the term diversity, and then the relationship between diversity-friendly practice and recovery-oriented practice in general. And then finally, an overview of some of the recommendations, and the guideline itself will dip into the first guideline and leave the elaboration of the details of the subsequent guidelines to future webinars. So in getting started, I'm going to give you the big conclusion for the whole webinar, because I think it's important for us to see that addressing and respecting diversity is not something that's an add-on to recovery-oriented practice. It's not something that can be separated from it, that in a very real sense, the basic principles that inform and drive a recovery orientation, many of them are the same principles that apply and create a positive space for developing diversity-friendly practice. So in that sense, respect for diversity flows from the basic principles of a recovery orientation. But it doesn't mean that that means that everything is done, that every situation is the same, or that just doing basic recovery-oriented practice means that you automatically address all the diversity-related issues. So in addition to them flowing from the basic principles, we also have to do a little bit more work and in respecting, understanding, and addressing diversity in order for any practice to be truly recovery-oriented. They are so tightly entwined that I don't think you can have a practice and call it truly recovery-oriented unless at the same time you are also building in the right direction to respect, honor, and address diversity-related issues. But it is also true in that context that not only will that enhance the ability to meet the diverse needs of a diverse Canadian population, but being diversity friendly will also enhance and strengthen all aspects of a recovery-oriented practice. So I hope that in the course of the webinar today that I'm able to illustrate that idea that recovery and diversity go hand in hand, although there are some things that we need to pay particular attention to if we're going to have recovery-oriented practice that is truly diversity-friendly. So I'm going to start with the first point on the agenda, why diversity is an important issue and what we understand by diversity in the guidelines for recovery-oriented practice. So as with all things related to the guidelines, the origins of the approach and the understanding and the principles behind the approach to diversity is rooted in the mental health strategy itself. So as I did in the first webinar in the series, I would encourage people, if they want a bit of a deeper dive into some of the aspects of diversity and other aspects, and to consult the documents related to the mental health strategy, Changing Directions, Changing Lives, and its predecessor toward recovery and well-being. And the essential point that I think we make throughout the mental health strategy is that diversity needs to be seen as a strength. Diversity needs to be seen as something that contributes not only to the broad Canadian social fabric, to our common culture, but that learning from people from diverse backgrounds will have enhance and strengthen our understanding of mental health and mental health issues right across the board. The approach taken to diversity in both the strategy and in the guidelines is a very broad one, and this is the list that we developed in the strategy and that has been brought forward into the guidelines, that we encourage and look for and want to help build a mental health system that is able to respond to the diverse individual and group needs, as well as to the disparities that can arise from a whole series of circumstances, backgrounds, and conditions that people across the country face. So I think if you take a look at that list initially, I think everybody will be able to find a touch point on there for themselves. It doesn't mean that we all confront diversity in exactly the same way, but it does mean that basically when we stop and think about it, I think it's fair to say that we are all both the same as everyone else and different from them, in the sense that we all are unique individual human beings, and that applies right across the board, obviously. But at the same time as we are individuals, we also share some things with other people that marks us off as a group, a category, something, whatever you want to call it, that is different from other groups. So that it's something that is absolutely inevitable. I, as a white, male, middle-aged, Canadian born of Jewish origin will be similar to other people who share some of those characteristics. I will be different from others in those same groups as well. So in that sense, there is the idea of difference, that we are all the same, yet we all share some characteristics with some people that differentiate us from others, is something that is absolutely inevitable, and that, I think, is part of what we mean by celebrating diversity and celebrating difference as something that enriches our lives and the lives of our communities. The problems arise when these differences constitute a basis for disparities, for different ways of treating people, inequalities, prejudice, discrimination that can be based on people's belonging to one group or another. So while the differences are inevitable, the creation of disparities is not inevitable. So the categories that we had in that list, I think if we look back at them, they're composed of people who have one or more of the following. There are common needs or characteristics. If we think of people at whatever stage of life, people, young people, old people will have some needs, some characteristics that are the same as other people in that same category. It can be that we've confronted similar circumstances. The list included geographic origin, language spoken. All of these things will serve as a basis on which people can be differentiated, but they're also a basis in many instances where forms of discrimination can exist. Or we have a common set of experiences, people who come from outside Canada, migration history, experiences as being part of a racialized community and experience racism in some form or other are all different experiences that mark some groups and not others. So I'm just, oops, sorry folks, I'm just having trouble with my fingers here. So the importance of addressing diversity, did I skip one here? Is that it can serve as one of the bulwarks against the differences that occur naturally, that occur across society, from being erected into forms of discrimination or prejudice that create disparities, either in access to health services, mental health services, or create unequal outcomes for people because of the kind of discrimination that they may face. So again, differences do not automatically produce inequities. It depends on how they're addressed, and how they're addressed within the mental health system is something that we control to a great degree, and something that recovery orientation encourages us to work on. And they're important because the literature right across the board indicates that inequities have an impact on health outcomes, whether it be physical health or mental health. We know that there are many gradients that are associated with access to services, access to education, income levels, that unfortunately the better off you are, the better educated you are, the better your health outcomes, and it goes down to, has an impact on very directly on people's lives. So when we talk about addressing disparity, it therefore doesn't mean that we're talking about providing special treatment for people, something that's offering some things to some people that others don't get. Rather, it is very much the opposite. We're talking about trying to ensure that there is a level playing field, and that barriers to access to services, or that hold some people back and not others, are addressed in as effective a way as possible. And just to conclude this section then, the quote here is from the mental health strategy. I believe it's from Toward Recovery and Well-Being. And if you look at the second sentence, inclusive and culturally responsive services promote practices that recognize and help counteract all forms of discrimination and address the structural barriers that can limit access to appropriate programs, treatments, services, and supports for people from diverse backgrounds. So that's our goal, and the ability of the mental health system to meet everyone's needs depends on our ability to practice in both a recovery-oriented and a diversity-friendly way. So now to look at the relationship between recovery orientation and diversity-friendly practice. And as I said at the outset, what I'm going to suggest is that the recovery orientation is inherently diversity-friendly. It doesn't mean that every practice is automatically as sensitive and responsive to diversity issues, but that the principles and driving elements behind a recovery orientation create a favorable context in which to address diversity issues. And this begins with the very foundation, what we identified in both the recovery guidelines and in the recovery declaration as the two pillars that hold up the entire edifice of recovery-oriented practice. And these are the basic recognition that there is both an individual and a social dimension to what has an impact on our mental health and well-being. It's often referred to as biopsychosocial, being the factors that influence mental health, the bio being more individually related, but we argue that not only do we recognize each person's uniqueness as an individual, but also their rights that come associated with that to determine as best as possible their own journey towards mental well-being and recovery. At the same time, this journey never takes place in isolation. It never takes place where none of us lives apart from our communities, from our families, from our jobs, from whatever connects us to the rest of Canadian society, potentially has an impact on our mental health and well-being, so that we cannot, nor can we ignore the social dimensions of mental health, and that creates the twin pillars upon which the entire recovery edifice rests. And I think we'll see that by addressing it in that way, it does create a favorable context for diversity-friendly practice. But it's not just that foundational notion of the twin pillars, the individual and the social dimension, that links recovery-oriented practice to diversity-friendly practice. There are others as well, a few of which I just want to highlight here. In the first place, when we talk about groups, there's always a danger that you either lump everybody in one group as being identical to everybody else in that same group, and that's clearly not true. People who share some aspect of a common background do not necessarily share all aspects of that common background. Similarly, the features of different groups that make it important to address their particular and specific needs do not arise from something that is built into their nature, that is inherent in the people belonging to those groups, but it's rather the factors and circumstances that they confront by one category of individuals that others may not confront that put them at a greater risk or place them at a disadvantage. So that it's not something that is inherent to the person, but it is something that grows out of their experience that creates the need and the importance for a recovery-oriented system to address diversity. Now, if we think back to some of the things that I think are foundational to a recovery orientation, very simply that when we start out in the mental health field using language that is non-discriminatory, language that is not prejudicial towards people living with mental health problems, is something that is absolutely fundamental to creating an atmosphere and a culture that will support people in their journey of recovery. But once we accept that the way we approach things, the approach to the language that we use, the cultural background of people, and the way in which the system treats people based on their mental health problems, I think we can easily extend that and see that similar considerations apply to people from diverse backgrounds. So we have to be sensitive to issues relating to language, culture, and imbalances of power. They matter to people. They matter to everybody living with a mental health problem, and similarly, they matter to people coming from the full range of diverse backgrounds that we identified earlier. And this means that there are many dimensions and many types of discrimination and exclusion that can have an impact on mental health. But as well, when we combine an understanding of both the individual and the social dimensions of mental health, I think it's pretty obvious that each and every one of us is a complex and multifaceted individual. And again, going back to some of the foundational principles of a recovery orientation, it has been argued, and rightly, that people should never be labeled by their mental health condition, the struggles that they face, the situation that they face. That is not the defining feature of any individual person. We are all more than a mental health condition, and similarly, we are also all more than any single dimension of the factors that affect our lives. So, as I said earlier, when we think about people and as being part of a particular group in some fashion, it doesn't mean that it means we should be very careful about avoiding stereotyping and acknowledging that while two individuals may share a common cultural heritage, for example, they may also be very different in other ways, such as by age, gender, sexual orientation, religious or spiritual beliefs. And finally, if we think about the principles behind a recovery orientation, one of the central ones is that we value and respect and learn from lived experience, that people are the experts in their own lives, and that this is essential in order to develop a collaborative relationship with people that will support them in a journey of recovery. But again, once we accept that lived experience is something to be honored and respected, it is not simply the lived experience of mental health problems that needs to be so respected, but it can easily expand and extend to striving to understand, respect, and honor the lived experience and the knowledge that is derived from different ways of understanding mental health and mental wellness, and being able to incorporate that as best as possible into a recovery-oriented practice. So I just want to conclude this section by talking a bit about how in the preceding chapters of the recovery guidelines, what we call the non-diversity chapters, how some of this attention to diversity-related issues is present throughout the guidelines. So while we have special chapters in the guidelines that deal with diversity, and another chapter that deals with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, nonetheless, the underlying importance of respecting diversity is present throughout the guidelines. And I'm going to pause for just a brief moment because something I should have said earlier regarding First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'll just mention that now. While we have included the importance of understanding First Nations, Inuit, and Métis background as one of the sources of diversity, and also potentially one of the sources of people being discriminated, we also don't present the detailed guidelines on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in the same chapter because of the particular historical significance of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis for Canada's history and ongoing struggles to find roads to reconciliation. But there are many, again, of these same principles that apply to diversity, that apply in the context of working as best as possible with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So I just wanted to make sure that people see that we both incorporated some of the dimensions in this chapter, but also because of the importance of understanding the particular evolution of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canadian society, that there's a specific chapter in the guidelines that addresses that issue. So now going back to the original, the first chapter, which is on promoting a culture and language of hope and optimism, here one of the guidelines is to encourage a consideration of cultural, social connections and roles, physical activity, sexuality, creative expression, and connection to faith communities as potential sources of meaning and hopefulness. But once again, if we're talking about creating a climate of hope, one has to be able to take into account the context of the individual person, understand their background, and relate as best as possible to promoting those connections that have meaning and value for that person in order to best support them in their journey of recovery. In the second chapter on recovery is personal, we affirm again the idea that the multiple intersecting factors that affect everyone's mental health have to be taken into account. And again, once we do that, we think about family context, cultural background, personal values, spiritual beliefs, all of which are defined potentially categories of people who have either specific needs or are facing particular challenges within the system or more broadly in society that need to be acknowledged and addressed in the context of recovery-oriented practice. And as well, I guess, the recurring issue of grounded in our understanding of the historical challenges that people with mental health problems have faced in being treated with dignity, with respect, equally within the mental health system. Similarly, addressing power imbalances is something that is of great importance to people from a great many backgrounds. The third chapter addresses recovery occurs in the context of one's life, and advocates for recovery-oriented practice to be able to advocate for and to address inequitable living circumstances and unequal opportunity, once again, something that can transcend a great number of the categories of diversity that we've just looked at. Recovery-oriented mental health services can help connect people to their communities of choice, assist in maintaining naturally occurring supports, focus on social inclusion and the exercise of citizenship rights, which easily becomes part of not only recovery-oriented but diversity-friendly practice. Communities become the space where people can themselves recover and engage in, become active citizens in all respects, while at the same time finding meaning according to their own customs, traditions, culture, and upbringing. So fundamentally, a theme that we particularly highlighted in Toward Recovery and Well-Being, the foundational document for the mental health strategy, there is no us and them when it comes to mental health issues. The fundamental commonality of our human situation means that everybody deserves the same respect and the same access to the support that they need when they are confronting mental health challenges. But acknowledging that there is no us and them doesn't mean, not only doesn't mean, but requires us to recognize that there are differences amongst us, that diversity needs to be respected, and disparities must be addressed so that we can end up with a system that supports people and is as adapted as possible to meeting people's specific needs, and that no group or groups are disadvantaged by the way that the mental health system and all services operate. So now to move on to the final section, which is just a brief overview of the actual guideline on diversity, which is Chapter 4 of the guidelines, and I'll be doing looking at just the first guideline. And as Amy indicated at the beginning, subsequent webinars will delve more deeply into the specific ways in which recovery-oriented practice can address particular needs of particular communities or groups. So when we talk about diversity, I don't think anybody really believes this, that every practitioner should know everything that needs to be known about every community, every age group, every particular situation that some people face. So it's not, the expectation is not that everybody knows everything, but rather that the starting point for creating a diversity-friendly, recovery-oriented practice is that everybody has a general approach that is based on a respect for and interest in the diversity of people's needs, and it builds on their existing strengths. All of these are, by the way, direct quotes from the recovery guidelines, so you should be able to find them if you want to refer to them again. But simply recognizing that there is that diversity, again, would not be enough unless we also acknowledge the dimension that there are disparities that are real, that people confront, both in their access to mental health services, whether they're available to them in their own language, whether they feel comfortable accessing services, and that is an obstacle to the kind of support that people need, that recovery-oriented and diversity-friendly services can address. At the same time as we address them within the mental health system, we call on recovery-oriented practitioners to work with others to address the adverse impacts on mental health and well-being that occur in the broader social context. The values and attitudes that animate recovery-oriented, diversity-friendly practice. I don't think it can be said often enough in the current context where issues relating to diversity are certainly front and center in the election process in our neighbors to the south, that for us, I believe, as a society, we have come to the conclusion that embracing, valuing, and celebrating diversity is not a threat to our values, is not a threat to our society, but is very much a strength from which we can all draw upon and benefit. That recovery-oriented, diversity-friendly practice recognizes and acknowledges that there are multiple forms of discrimination and prejudice that can occur in society, and incorporates that understanding in the ways of developing recovery-oriented practice. And that not only should we be prepared to work within our practices, but reach out to communities and that are disadvantaged or marginalized, to work with them to see how best to address the barriers that people from those communities encounter in striving to access mental health services when they need them. I think it's important when we think about the values and attitudes that animate recovery-oriented, diversity-friendly practice to also see that there can be ways that may either be unfamiliar to us, different from ways in which we approach mental health, well-being, illness, treatment, and that there are many pathways to recovery. We talk about the journey of recovery being a uniquely individual journey. That means it takes place within the context of each person's cultural set of beliefs and so on. And when we say this, and I'll probably repeat this again at some point, it doesn't mean that everything that everybody does is necessarily beneficial to their mental health, whatever the source of inspiration for it. So it doesn't mean that acknowledging diversity means accepting that all practices are necessarily beneficial to people or beneficial to their mental health. And in the guidelines, when we talk about families, for example, we say that the family is potentially a critical source of support for people, and that involving family members is essential, is positive for supporting people on their journey of recovery. But we also acknowledge that families can sometimes be a source of the problem, that there are issues that arise in families, domestic violence, abuse, that can prevent and prohibit the family from playing a positive role, and they may even have been one of the sources for a person's mental health challenges. And that kind of dynamic can apply in various cultural situations or for different approaches to mental health and well-being. So I think we want to encourage people to start with the assumption that connections to family, culture, and natural supports is important, but also be open and aware of the potential for needing to address issues that arise precisely out of those circumstances. That we also acknowledge that there are many different ways in which people can conceive of themselves in relationship to their families and their social contexts. For some, family connections may be stronger than for others in certain communities. Certainly when we think of some of the traditions in indigenous cultures that link people to land, to their ancestors, to the traditions, that creates a sense of community that is very different from that other people who don't have that don't share that background might have. So we need to know, in terms of the knowledge that will inform diversity-friendly, recovery-oriented practices. We need to know about the potential differing values that are placed on individual autonomy, family unity, community cohesion that exist within different traditions and cultures and contexts, and to work with people to understand how best they can be supported within those contexts in their journeys of recovery and well-being. I haven't said a lot about the lifespan, but I did note at the beginning that it is one of the diverse elements that we identify as requiring particular attention and understanding, and that a recovery orientation needs to understand the implications for recovery approaches across the lifespan, that In both the strategy and the guidelines, we've argued that the basic underlying principles of recovery orientation will apply across the lifespan, but that it's very important to be able to adapt and address as people age amongst older adults, but also in children and youth. The ways in which recovery-oriented practice will be developed will necessarily have to be adapted to the realities of the different stages of life. And as well, that the ways in which the practices are adapted to be able to address diverse needs. We've highlighted the importance of training in cultural responsiveness, cultural safety, and cultural competence for mental health practitioners and in service delivery. The skills and behavior, again, it's not that people should, the idea that we need to start from a position of respecting and being willing to address the diverse needs means that we need to be proactive in reaching out and seeking the information from people about their expectations, their preferences, their needs, and working with them to develop appropriate responses. And we need to be able to collaborate with the diverse communities beyond the mental health sphere in order to understand what the context of people's lives is and how recovery-oriented services can best be adapted to meet their needs. And then finally, we need to support people to identify those practices that, including spiritual activities that they might find helpful and contribute to their mental health and well-being. And again, just to say that both of those parts of that sentence are important. It's those practices that will contribute to their mental health and well-being that we want to support, and that there may, as in any complex cultural or belief system, there may be some aspects that for some people are not beneficial, and working with them to understand those is equally important. So the final sections of each of the guidelines look at the reflective practice questions, and there are just a few of them here that I've highlighted. The first one is, again, not something that I've spoken about much so far, but I think it's really a critical one for us to appreciate that sometimes when we think about culture and its impact on mental health practice, we see other people's culture. We see the ways in which diverse groups will approach mental health, and see that as the ways in which culture and different value systems affect our approach to mental health and well-being. But the reality is that we all bring certain biases to the table. We all bring our own worldview. We all bring our own cultural understanding. And throughout the guidelines, we've tried to encourage people to appreciate the importance of critical self-reflection on the things that they're doing and looking into their own ways of thinking to see if there are some barriers to connecting with people that might arise from some assumptions that we may not even initially be aware of. So we all bring culture to the table, and we all need to adopt a critical approach to those values that we bring to the work that we do. And then we need to include, we need to not simply work within the familiar confines of our own settings, but be prepared to include people from diverse backgrounds, to reach out to communities and seek out opportunities in diverse communities to help to create that shared understanding of mental health, and to create opportunities for people right across the lifespan. So basically, that concludes my brief overview of the guideline and brings me back, if you will, to the starting point for this webinar, which is that respect for diversity, again, is not an add-on to recovery-oriented practice, but is something that we can both build upon the basic principles of recovery orientation in order to create a diversity-friendly practice, but recognize that we need to do that in order for our practices to be fully recovery-oriented and to strengthen them in all their dimensions. So I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Howard, for being here and for walking us through those slides to provide us with an overview of the diversity dimension in the recovery guidelines. I know I was certainly struck by the notion that diversity and recovery, diversity is a core part of recovery, and yet they also go hand in hand. And I also particularly liked when you talked about how diversity is to be respected and celebrated and valued, and that, you know, we have a chance to also acknowledge difference, learn from it, learn from one another, but then and learn about how disparity impacts people's health and wellness and how inequity impacts people's health and wellness, but also how we can take action to address that, because we know that equity also has as much of a positive impact on people's health and wellness. So thank you for that. So we have time to answer some questions, so if you have any for Howard, feel free to pose them. To get things started, I thought that for those of you who are comfortable, if you wanted to type in the chat function, that we would, I'd ask you the first question from the reflective practice questions that was back on slide 29. So how do your own values, assumptions, and worldview shape your approach to others and influence your practice? So this is a chance for you to provide us with some thoughts on how diversity plays out in your work, how you're impacted from it, and then also to pose some questions for Howard or for the group on this topic. So I'll give people a moment to type some answers in. And if not, you also can have a chance just to reflect to yourself and think about how that impacts your work. We have a couple of other questions that I'll be able to go to after this. Thanks to all of you. I hope some of you were thinking about that. We have a couple of questions that have come in. One is that, you know, on one of the slides there was a list of sort of different aspects of diversity in this chapter, and one that someone noted is that there wasn't linguistic minority listed as well. Is there a reason for that, or was it just a...
It is listed in the sense that there is language spoken is one of the characteristics that is included there. In developing the guidelines, though, it was clear that we couldn't address absolutely every dimension of diversity with the same depth. If people are interested in referring back to the mental health strategy, there is a section in Chapter 3, I believe, or 4 perhaps, of the strategy that addresses the importance of mental health services that respond to people's needs in their preferred language spoken, and that acknowledges the dimension that minority linguistic communities, either Anglophone in Quebec or Francophone outside of Quebec, often have really important challenges in gaining access to mental health services. So while there isn't a specific guideline on it, it is at least nominally acknowledged in the list of characteristics of diversity, and we did some work in the mental health strategy to be able to at least provide a framework in which we can think about how best to develop services that are responsive to people in their preferred language. And it is an important question. I think it is. We know that, for example, as people age, even if they speak both languages, it becomes much easier for people to communicate in their maternal language rather than speaking a language that is not their first language. So there are challenges associated with it, because minority language communities, certainly outside of big urban centers, can often have real limitations in the services that are available to them. So some kinds of solutions need to be found to that, using translation services, interpreters, where feasible.
Thanks, Howard. We have another question here around thinking about diversity-friendly practice and how you build some of your knowledge and skills related to that. So do you have any strategies you can recommend on how people could access knowledge about diversity from people with lived experience or from within different communities?
I don't have anything. I don't think that we didn't include in the guidelines. And again, I think, once again, the starting point is that proactive willingness to reach out to people of diverse backgrounds in order to learn about their particular circumstances. I think beyond that, people will know in their communities who the folks are who are maybe experiencing challenges in accessing services, or which communities they come into contact with regularly. And taking, I think the fundamental piece of advice is to try to take advice from the people in those communities, and not see it as if we all have to have all of the answers all of the time. There's also training that is available in various forms on cultural responsiveness and cultural competence, cultural safety, that I think if people perhaps seek out the recovery inventory, there will be resources there for them to be able to at least get a start on thinking about some of these issues.
Thank you. Another question that's come in is specific to the mental health needs of refugees. And do you have any thoughts on how we address the needs of that specific population?
You know, I guess this is probably an area where I'm best advised to defer that question to subsequent webinars, just because I think, as people probably know, I'm not a clinician or a practitioner, so some of the more detailed exploration of the specifics relating to these communities is something I think that the subsequent webinars will be able to address, unless there's someone else in the room here who wants to offer some thoughts on that. I know that the Mental Health Commission recently did a roundtable to explore the needs of the mental health needs of refugees, and I'm not sure if there's any wisdom that we can offer to people based on that.
Thanks, Howard. This is Bonita Varga, and I'm a knowledge broker with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and I also happen to work on our diversity file and with a focus on refugee mental health. So as Howard mentioned, we did just host a national roundtable on refugee mental health, where we brought experts and folks from the provinces and territories together to talk about the unique needs of that particular population. We're going to be releasing a summary report from that event, and we also have a backgrounder on refugee mental health available on our website. There it talks, I think, specifically about what some of the evidence is that's available currently for meeting the needs of refugee populations. There's quite a bit out there, and I think in particular, there are, I guess, the real needs, and what we found in the research is that by addressing the social determinants of health, we can do a lot more to support the mental health of refugees than investing highly in specialized treatment. Ensuring that people are connected with primary care physicians, that we have a robust settlement system. Those are things that are going to go a really, really long way to supporting the mental health of refugees. And that's not to say that we don't also need things like trauma-informed care, CBT, psychotherapies for folks. However, I think there are a couple of things that we can really do, places where we can really invest, and that backgrounder document that's available on our website will outline that very clearly.
If I could just add, again, just to tie it back to one of the themes of the webinar, I think what Benita just said highlights that connection between approaching mental health as an individual issue and approaching it as one where there are many social factors that influence and can have a negative impact on people's mental health and well-being. I think that looking at issues relating to the social determinants of health is clearly the social dimension, things like trauma-informed care, and just understanding how the impact of the trauma of being a refugee can have on people's mental wellness.
Thanks, Howard and Benita. We probably have time for one more question. And so we have a question that came in about how, while recovery is a term that's championed by people with lived experience, it doesn't necessarily always resonate with youth or potentially some other populations. So is there room to have more than one way to talk about recovery?
This is a long-standing issue in relation to recovery and recovery guidelines. It goes back to the very beginnings of our work on the mental health strategy. And I think we decided early on that whatever the limitations of the term recovery, it had become the term that was most widely used to encompass this wide range of principles and practices that we felt were essential to a mental health system that was able to respond to people's needs. So that's sort of the basic reason we stuck with the term recovery. Many people did raise issues relating to recovery, and in particular, either in relation to other cultural traditions where we've been told that for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, terms like wellness, more appropriate term resonates more strongly. For youth and children, is recovery appropriate because you're not really recovering anything, you're developing, you're growing, you're learning to be a fully functioning adult. For older adults, are we talking about recovery? You're not going back to where you once were, as much as those of us who are advancing in years would like to return to our physical health of our youth. You're not able to do that. So is recovery, does that convey the best impression? Well, all I can say is whenever this comes up, we go back to the underlying principles of what is behind a recovery orientation. And I'm always able to find principles there, the respect for dignity, the respect for individual rights, all of these things that are built into a recovery orientation that I think do and should and will resonate right across the lifespan, right across the cultural landscape. So I think the only way to do that, I don't think we can search for another term at this point to somehow be an even broader umbrella term, but my recommendation would be is admit that it's not the greatest term, that it doesn't always apply, it doesn't always say what or mean exactly what people think it should mean, but turn the conversation as much as possible to what is behind the recovery orientation, what are its fundamental principles and premises, and I think that the recovery guidelines do a pretty good job of outlining that and giving you the ability to find those principles that are most relevant to the person or group or conversation that you're having.
Great. Thanks, Howard. So I just want to take a moment to thank you all for joining us today, and a special thanks to our presenter, Howard Chodos. And then as well, I wanted to thank both Benita Varga and Hannah Kohler, who are commission staff who've been behind the scenes helping answer some of your questions and help put this webinar together. A reminder that our next recovery-oriented practice webinar is going to be on Thursday, July 21st. And this one is focused specifically on the dimension related to working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So we're going to be fortunate to have Mary Bartram and Donna Lyons, who are key contributors to the development of that chapter, who will be joining us to present, along with Bill Hill, who is using the guidelines to co-create programs for First Nations in London, Ontario. So hopefully you'll all be able to join us. Just a quick reminder that this webinar was recorded and will be posted on our website in a few weeks along with some of the slides from today. And then also a reminder that we ask that you take a moment to fill out the customer satisfaction survey. That's going to pop up on your screen when you leave the webinar. So this is really important if you want to continue to receive invitations to our monthly webinar series. You're going to be able to opt in there. And it's for privacy reasons that we ask you to let us know through this survey if you want to be contacted about future webinars and events. So thank you again for joining us. If you have any questions about today's webinar, please contact myself or Benita at the Mental Health Commission, and we look forward to hosting you next month when we talk about working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis.